There, is it going? Yeah, it's going now. Oops, cancel. So we're gonna go ahead and get into unit 1. E-dynamics curriculum is a little bit different than Apex curriculum. So when you go into, say, like the first lesson, it's gonna be similar to Apex. You kind of scroll through it, you click the next button down here. Where E-dynamics really starts to look different than Apex is when you get to quizzes and assignments. Mostly quizzes. Quizzes in E-dynamics curriculum are actually Canvas quizzes, which is very different from the Apex stuff. So today we're going to go ahead and look at the first few like lesson pieces, and I'm going to kind of like talk through those things with you. So lesson 1 is, whoops, that's not what I want. Come on. Oh, I am on a roll this morning, y'all. Chimney Christmas. Okay. So the next couple weeks, weekly plans have also been posted, just so you guys know. So lesson 1 is just an introduction to Lord of the Rings. So the movies were highly successful. They attracted a ton of people over to the Lord of the Rings series. Granted, it had a huge fan base before. The fact they hadn't made it into movies yet is probably more surprising than the fact that it was popular. Also, and I will stand by this, Lord of the Rings is one of the few movie adaptations of books that was done well. And I would say Lord of the Rings was done a lot better than The Hobbit. One sec. So for many reasons, because The Hobbit, they took lots and lots of liberties with. So Lord of the Rings, well over 150 million copies of Lord of the Rings have been sold. It's been translated into over 38 languages, which is pretty gosh darn impressive. There we go. And it has inspired, it has inspired so much. Dungeons and Dragons would not exist without Lord of the Rings. Fantasy as we know it would not exist without Dungeons and Dragons and Lord of the Rings. So like if you think of a fantasy novel, a fantasy film, any of it, it has its core was inspired by Lord of the Rings. So here is a picture of Tolkien's grave. So there is him and his wife are both there. Still attracts tons of people. Okay. Oh, continuity. So when we think of the Lord of the Rings series, it comes after The Hobbit. So The Hobbit happens first, which is a smaller book than any of the 3 Lord of the Rings books. And then the Lord of the Rings trilogy goes Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and then Return of the King. So in that order, books 1, 2, 3. They're fantastic. So this class, like this first part of this class, because we're not going to spend the entire term on Lord of the Rings, although we could. Don't underestimate me. We're going to be focusing in on Lord of the Rings. We're going to be looking at the films more so than the books. I do have some scans of some things from the books so that we will look at. And I have some audiobook clips and stuff too, because I really like Lord of the Rings. So I have all of these things. So Tolkien as an author and his life story actually kind of like hit the forefront again. They made a movie about him, so a biography movie called Tolkien. It released in 2019. I have a clip from it. So there, I don't remember this guy's name. Let me see if I can get him on here. This guy. He plays Tolkien. I'm sure I probably should know his name. So this is a part from the movie of him talking to the actress playing Edith. So that would be Tolkien's wife. So Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien is John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. So that's his full name. But he goes by J.R.R. His son was also named John, not to make this confusing. He was born in South Africa. So, and he lived there for a while, but it didn't kind of like agree with him. I'm gonna stop sharing that way. It feels less like I'm weirdly talking. So he was born in South Africa. His family lived there. His dad worked for the British Bank. So if you know anything about the colonization of Africa, South Africa was colonized by the British. That's why they're the official language is English in South Africa. They colonized, set up shop, and actually had a very like a thriving community there. This is where lots and lots of racist like practices, apartheid, if you've ever heard of that, that was South Africa. So anyway, the Tolkiens lived there because J.R.R. Tolkien's dad was a banker and he worked for the British Bank in South Africa. Now, it didn't agree with Ronald, so J.R.R. And so his mom took him and his younger brother back to England. And the dad was supposed to follow shortly after. There we go. So the dad was supposed to follow shortly after. The problem is in that time, and by shortly after, I mean a couple of years. That's how things kind of moved at that time. Because I mean, Tolkien was born in the late 1800s. So dad was supposed to follow. Unfortunately, he died before he could rejoin them in England. So that left Tolkien's mom caring for two young boys on her own. Now, they had some money. They were fairly well off. I'm not saying that, but like money was still tight. There was nobody bringing it in because his dad was dead. So his mom really buckled down. She couldn't afford to put the boys into like super prestigious schools. She knew they'd have to get scholarships. She really, really buckled down with these boys because she took it seriously. It helps that she had been a governess before. So she taught them reading and writing, which I believe they learned 4 before the age of 4. Yes. But also other things like botany and drawing and Latin and French, very well-rounded education. So by the time he was 12, he was able to get a good scholarship to go to a private school, which is great because that set him onto the career path that led him to where he got. So he starts going to really good schools. He ended up at Oxford. He excelled in languages, in particular Latin and Greek and English. He was an excellent writer and he was an excellent critic. So he really focused. So let's see here. He joined several societies. There we go. The Tea Club and Barovian Society. He joined that at his time at King Edward's, where he really focused in on classical literature, in particular kind of these ones that were precursors to fantasy. Like he was really into Beowulf. He was really into Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and Norse mythology and Arthurian mythology. So he did a lot of reading. He focused in on those, and you can really see those come through in what he chose to write about after World War I. Now, while J.R.R. was off at school, still fairly young, his mom died too. So his mom was named Mabel, and she died from complications from diabetes at 34. Ronald was only 12 at the time. And then from that time on, he was raised by a family friend who became guardian of the two boys and began to oversee their education and moral development. So basically he took over raising them, but they were also off at finishing school. So like, you know, it wasn't like a full-time parenting gig. So J.R. really dove into academics. Eventually, he landed himself over at Oxford University, where he studied medieval literature and something else. And he was at Oxford and working in these like academic fields until World War I. So he trained for the military and eventually fought in World War I. So World War I, of course, was just a nightmarish situation. If you have not taken US history yet, World War I is the reason we have things like the Geneva Conventions. Well, no, that's technically World War II, but kind of World War I. So World War I was nasty, nasty. The conditions for the soldiers that they were fighting in was terrible. We're talking soldiers living in mud trenches for months. Disease was rampant. People were dying from really awful infections, some of which were caused by just being in the wet and the gross. And some were caused from even relatively small bullet wounds that then began to fester. Gangrene was a killer. It could be a death sentence. There was not enough penicillin to go around. So World War I was awful. So he served in World War I, but not as like a frontline soldier. So he wasn't in the trenches so much. He worked in code, messaging, really using his linguistic skills, which is impressive. And he lost a lot of friends in the war effort, which you can see when especially when we get to Return of the King, and the way he handles the large war. Although you can also see it in the way that characters reflect back on previous wars in The Lord of the Rings. So after the war, he did return to Oxford, became a professor of literature, and he taught there until retirement. Like, he was there for a long time. Tolkien is one of the first people to work on the Oxford English Dictionary. He was one of like the leaders of it. So he's got an enduring legacy in that regard as well. So how did he come to write The Hobbit? He was a super academic guy. How did he write this super high fantasy story, right? So when this would be lesson 3, if you're curious, I'm trying to go in order. So Tolkien, he spent some time in the hospital during World War I. And then after World War I would say he was definitely haunted by the whole thing, right? It was very mentally damaging. When we talk about soldiers coming back from war now, we use the term PTSD. They didn't use that back then. They were shell-shocked. And the idea was that soldiers should just get over it, which is why the suicide rate of returning soldiers after World War I was incredibly high. So how The Hobbit started was Tolkien was, he was grading. He was just kind of chilling at Oxford, working on grading some papers from his students. I'm sure that they were fantastic papers. And teachers never, ever get distracted when we're grading. No, never, ever happens. I'm presuming somebody snickered at my joke there. So he wrote just on a side piece of paper, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit." And we have proof of this. Like, this is legit. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. The thing is, he didn't know what a hobbit was. So after that, from that one line that he wrote, came The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. And it started out with him having to figure out, what is a hobbit? He turned to some of his like works of literature that he had focused on, his kind of like go-to pieces. So Beowulf and Sir Gawain, to start figuring out what are these different creatures. Norse mythology as well. You can actually see little bits of Norse mythology in The Hobbit. They have these dwarf-like creatures that don't really match the Tolkien dwarves, but like you can see elements of the Norse dwarves in Tolkien dwarves for sure, but also in The Hobbits. So he came up with The Hobbit, and that's when he started writing it. So this is post World War I, pre World War II. So the 1920s, and he is teaching at Oxford, and he starts writing The Hobbit. When The Hobbit publishes, it publishes for children. It is a children's book because like this idea of adults reading these whimsical fairy tales was like not a thing at that time. Adults were supposed to read nonfiction, and it was quite boring. Tolkien helped pave the way for many other fiction writers, including Charles Dickens. When we think of like great great American authors, Dickens being British. So it was a new thing. Like there was nothing else like The Hobbit other than old fairy tales. And even then they weren't epic quests like this. This was like fairy tale meets Beowulf. And Beowulf, of course, is from kind of Norse. It was an oral tale that was then written down by Christian monks who came to try and civilize the uncivilized pagan peoples. So that's why Beowulf is written the way it is. And we'll get to Beowulf. I love Beowulf. Tolkien and I have much in common. I also love Beowulf and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Shocker. So it's also around this time he started like linking up with other authors, including one C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis being the author of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Also fantastic. They were contemporaries and they were kind of writing very similarly. And they wrote these kind of high fantasy kind of stories that were then marketed to as for kids. They were marketed to children. Now, C.S. Lewis, The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe is legitimately a children's book. Legit, like it is. It is about children, written for children, and is also incredibly religious at its core. Tolkien was not going the same route, and they actually like had tiffs over it. A tiff being like a little fight. So Tolkien and Lewis, in some ways, are the closest comparing contemporaries of the time, but they really weren't going for the same goal. Tolkien wrote something that was more complex. I'm going to go with more complex. So after The Hobbit came The Lord of the Rings. If you don't know about The Hobbit, there is an overview in lesson 3 that I would encourage you to like look at. Basically, if you've seen the Hobbit movies, they're close to the book, but also the movies took a ton of liberties. So while the Lord of the Rings movies stick close to the book and had to cut some stuff, The Hobbit, because they took one book that is shorter and made it into 3 movies, they added weird things to the Hobbit movies. So everything in the Hobbit movies is not all in the books. It's very strange. It's very strange. It's like the total opposite of what normally happens with books and movies. So like Legolas is not in The Hobbit, but he's somehow in that movie, probably just because they wanted Orlando Bloom, because Orlando Bloom sells tickets. So that follows Bilbo Baggins. The Hobbit follows Bilbo Baggins and basically how he comes to possess the one ring to rule them all. Because without the Hobbit, without Bilbo getting that, there would be no Lord of the Rings series, because that ring would never have made its way to Frodo. This is where we meet a lot of the important characters, including Gollum and Bilbo. That's who Bilbo gets the ring from. Gollum's backstory we find out much later. And Bilbo eventually brings the ring back to the Shire with him, unintentionally starting the rest of the story. It is worth noting that in the first edition of The Hobbit, the way that Bilbo gained the ring was different. In the original version, Gollum was an eccentric character, and the winning of the ring was a friendly contest. However, when Lord of the Rings was published, Tolkien had to rewrite that bit because he needed to change Gollum into a villain. So he gave the ring like added influence. And Bilbo kind of explains that away by saying that he told a fib. So to write The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, Tolkien had to develop a whole world, a map and countries. You'll notice that when you look at the map, it kind of vaguely resembles Europe. Shock. The races of Middle Earth, he had to develop what is a hobbit. He developed the elves, he developed the dwarves, he developed all of their interconnectedness. And he's got journals upon journals upon journals of this stuff that came from while writing and after writing, and as he was expanding the universe, because he died before he actually finished all of his stuff that he had been working on with the Lord of the Rings universe. One book was published posthumously, so after his death, and that is the Silmarillion. That one was completed but unpublished at the time of his death, and his son finished it up and got it published. The only ones that he published while alive were the Hobbit, Lord of the Rings trilogy. That's all he published in terms of this series. He did a lot of essay writing as well, and of course he published the Oxford English Dictionary. So he was a busy guy. So in developing this, he developed the races and their backstories. So the elves are considered the most ancient and powerful race of Middle Earth. Though at the time of the story, they're starting to kind of leave in Lord of the Rings. Like they're starting to get onto boats and return to their homeland in the West. So basically, elves are basically immortal. They can be killed. They have incredibly long lifespans. And if you want to know more about them, that is the Silmarillion. You want to like read that. It's awesome. It goes more deeply into their history. He also developed a full history that talks about like first and second and third ages, and like it's a whole thing. Notable elves include Elrod, of course, of Rivendell. And then let's see here, Arwen, Elros, some of these others. There's quite a few. Arwen being the one who falls in love with Aragorn. Aragorn being, I can't finish that without spoiling. Aragorn's important. You'll find out why. He is a man. So the race of man is incredibly gendered. I know, product of its time. But these are like humans like us. Race of men, very much like humans today. Mortal, good and evil tendencies. We see the full range of people throughout the books. There are different cities, like countries with different rulers, lots of wars, infighting. Very much the race of man in Lord of the Rings is supposed to be representative of us. And this is coming from a post-World War I Tolkien who really has some opinions about how much people suck, but also how much like potential people have, which we see through characters who really persevere and do good things. Then they're the race of dwarves. Dwarves were created differently from the elves, according to legend. And though they're mortal, they still have longer lifespans than man. But they're really known for their like endurance and their strength, and also being stubborn and hoarding gold. That part's not actually in this. Anyway, the dwarves are like craftsmen. They see beauty in things they make. So they see the beauty in like crafting. Whereas the elves, like as a distinction thing here, beauty is like nature and things that are made. And so like difference, big difference. The dwarves and the elves rarely see eye to eye. Like there is bad blood there. And so you'll see that when the Fellowship of the Ring is created in the first part of that movie, the elves and the dwarves do not trust each other, and nobody trusts the race of man. Nobody. And that has to do with history, because the race of man is the reason that the rings are the problem that they are. Thanks for that. The hobbits are Tolkien's creation. Like he made these things. You need to so they are like these little, they're smaller than dwarves. The idea is that hobbits are kind of they live in nature. They live in nature. They are very small. They're sure-footed. They're clever. They kind of remind me a little bit of like old school fairy myth, like a little bit of that. They seek pleasure. They like simple lives, and they really stay out of the politics of the other races, like the dwarves and the elves and the race of man. Like they got beefs, and the hobbits are just like, leave us out of this. And they like that's just what hobbits do. So and then the other race that is listed on the E-Dynamics is the Istari. Istari, I-S-T-A-R. They are a race of angelic spirits that were sent to Valar as attacked as guardians. So, also known as the wizards. So they took, for the most part, the forms of men while in Middle Earth, and each of them wielded very specific powers. So Saruman, bad guy, was chosen as the head of the White Council because of his skill with words in particular. The White Council was charged with investigating dangers Middle Earth and was comprised of Istari and various powerful elves, including Elrond and Galadriel. Gandalf was an Istari. He traveled, much more connected to the other races, and Radagast. I love Radagast in these films, y'all. I love Radagast. Appears in The Hobbit. Mainly dealt with like birds and animals. So then there's a couple other blue wizards who are mentioned but don't appear. So the Istari are the wizards, and that's why they're given the colors. So Saruman the white, Gandalf the gray, Radagast the brown. I don't know. I always just call him Radagast. Anyway, so the Istari, they're actually their own race. So the wizards are not like powerful men who somehow ascended. No, they're their own thing. They're their own thing. They just take the form that's similar to man, which is why when they're talking about the wizards, any of them, it sounds like they've kind of always been. Like there's no talk of like when Gandalf was born, you've just been. So they're even more immortal than the elves. All right. And then lesson 5 on here goes over the members of the Fellowship of the Ring. So I'm not going to go into that today, partially because we're out of our live time, and partially because it would make more sense for you to watch the first part of the film. So possibly over the weekend, depending on your time. Otherwise, next week, one of the assignments is to watch the first half of the Fellowship of the Ring. The first half. So if you're like me, you probably won't want to stop it and you're just going to watch the whole thing. This is also fine. Just know that the second half is assigned for the following week, just so you know. And the unit 1 stuff focuses on the first half, and unit 2 stuff focuses on the second half. Lesson 5 on here is kind of your cheat sheet to the different names. So it says it goes over who Gandalf is, who Legolas is, who Gimli is, who Boromir is. Boromir, who Aragorn is, as well as the hobbits. So we've got Merry, Pippin, Sam, and Frodo. And then we're about out of time. But on that note, if you are going to Rose City Comic Con this weekend, I'm jealous. And B, Frodo and Sam are going to be there, hence me being jealous. So that is what I have for you guys live today. At this point, you can go ahead and go work on things. You can get a head start on the stuff that's technically assigned for next week. I'm going to stop recording.